Well, howdy, Tri-State. If you have your Bibles or your smartphone or device, turn with me to Psalm chapter 96. I'm just going to go right into it today. Psalm 96. And we're going to start our summer series looking at this whole, basically looking at the book of Psalms all summer long. 150 altogether, not doing all of them. But if you track with us on our devotional page, we're doing about between 50 and 60 altogether. And what we're doing is that every single week we come together, we're looking at a different segment of the Psalms, or rather a different category of the Psalms, and looking at the way that the rhythms represented by the Psalms, or the Psalter, the book of Psalms, represents different areas of our lives and speaks differently to different situations depending where we're in. And so this morning what I want to do is I want to start off basic and look at just the fundamental question of why worship anything, and really examine what it actually means to worship and why we gather here on Sunday mornings, or why we include worship as a central facet of the Christian life. Like I grew up in a much more traditional church where we had the pipe organ, and we sang the hymnal like first, second, and fourth verses. Never the third for some reason. They hide something special in there. And what's happened in the last 30 years or so, longer than I've really been paying attention, is that we've kind of made this transition from the traditional to the more contemporary. But now, neither of those categories, traditional or contemporary, really covers the scope of what churches are doing, nor do those categories really express what worship fundamentally is. Because listen, if we're not careful, we often mistake worship for the music portion that happens once a week when we show up to church. And what I think that the Psalms do for us is the Psalms take everything in God's story and they just explode it outside the walls of the traditional boundaries of what is and is not necessarily what we usually think of in terms of biblical teaching. Like it's theology brought to life. It's God in the everyday, ordinary workings of the human story. And so when you look at the Psalms, most of which were written by a guy named David, they're psalms that talk about God's character as witnessed in the regular rhythms of life, both good and bad. So when we look at Psalm 96 then this morning, we're looking at one particular segment of the Psalms, or the Psalter, and we're looking at the way that particular psalm speaks magnificently to the human story. And listen, the whole idea of our series is looking at the way that each of these psalms fits differently into a different sort of playlist of what God has for his people. Like how many of you use like an iPod or iTunes regularly? Maybe you use like Pandora, Spotify, something like that. And what you can actually do is you can actually create your own playlist and say, like, here is my gym mix, or here is my running mix, or here's my car mix. And I have different sort of playlists or sets of songs that apply differently to different situations in life. And if you're a teenager today, you never had the inexplicable joy of crafting that mixtape, right? It's just one button today. You guys are lazy. I don't know what your deal is. So Psalm 96, let's just jump right in. It's a shorter psalm, but we're going to kind of make camp here, kind of, and kind of unpack some things along the way. So we'll be going all over the place. It's fine. Psalm 96, verse 1. I can't read. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. So right away, if you look, there's like a whole series of commands listed here in the first 3 verses. Like sing to the Lord, like tell everyone how awesome God is. Like declare his glory among the nations. Like everything that David is now saying in this brief opening song, or opening section of this song, is he's saying, listen, this is a part of your life. Like worship is meant to be a major part of your life. So the question then is, some of you are here this morning and you don't have much of a church background. And I've already said this morning that worship is more than merely a musical portion on a Sunday morning. And maybe the whole idea of worship sounds really alien or maybe foreign to you, or maybe something that's devoted exclusively to the whole religious crowd. I get that, but my first point I want to make this morning is simply this. Why worship anything? You can't avoid worshiping. See, everybody worships something. Like everybody worships something, okay? Let's go back a step. So I think I've missed something actually. If we look at the fundamental definition of worship, we have to examine that worship is the means by which you and I express and form our love for something. So we express our love, we form our love. Our love is actually expressed and shaped in the act of worship. That can be anything. It can be music, it can be writing, it can be art, it can be literally anything and everything you do can express and shape your love. See, from the very beginning, God actually created all of humanity with an innate, soul-level desire. Like no one in this room could possibly even exist if 2 people in your past did not feel some kind of desire for each other. Like desire is just fundamentally wired into the human condition. So back in the very beginning, even though God is completely self-sustained as Father, Son, and Spirit, his desire was to create a world that would reflect his goodness and his character. And so he did that. He created it and he called everything he made good. And he made Adam and Eve in his own image, it says, his own image, his own likeness. And because of that, you and I share certain mysterious attributes of God. We can create, we can relate. Like you and I share some of God's attributes in that way. And that's why God looks down after he first makes Adam and says, listen, it's not good for man to be alone. Like man has desires that are normal and are natural, and he needs a companion. He needs social interaction to be a real agent in my kingdom. That's what God says. So he looks down and says, listen, I'm going to make sure that I find Adam someone who is suitable for him. So he brings the animals together, okay, and he puts a profile for Adam on eHarmony, okay, and he tries to get all the different animals, like the duck wasn't a good match, and the horse wasn't a good match, and the pig was getting over her ex still. So nothing really worked out for Adam. And so listen, I'm going to make a suitable cooperator for Adam. So he forms Eve from the dust, I'm sorry, not from the dust of the earth, but from the side of the man. And so now Adam, when he looks at her for the first time, says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, this one shall be called woman, for she was taken from man. Don't miss that, because the very first words of recorded human speech were a love song written from man to woman. Desire is just fundamentally, innately wired into each of our minds, our hearts, our souls. And sometime later, a serpent kind of slithered his way into the garden, and now the forbidden fruit, the one thing God said was not good for man to do, Satan now tempts Eve and says, listen, don't listen to what God said, because if you eat this, you'll become like him. And what does it say? Genesis actually says that Eve looked at the fruit, saw it was desirable for gaining wisdom. She ate it and gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. So what Satan's design is to take everything about our desires in our world and twist them and flip them around so that our desire is no longer for the things of God, but for the things of this earth. And that's why it says in Jeremiah that we are people who, instead of looking towards the fresh water that God provides, we go to broken cisterns that can hold no water. And so for a lot of you, the reason you feel so strung out and so angry at life is because you're worshiping the wrong things. All of your loves are dedicated to the wrong things. The Bible calls that idolatry. In other words, our world is saturated by images, by symbols that reflect our fundamental, ingrown desire that we all have. The Germans actually have a word for this. It's called Sehnsucht. Okay, Sehnsucht is a fancy word that means that you have a longing for longing itself. Like your desire is for desire itself. And so in the New York Times about 2 years ago, a young woman wrote a whole article about the whole Pinterest movement. Okay, you with me? Like, who has a Pinterest or like an Instagram or one of those stupid things here? Okay, it's mostly pictures of cats. Okay? But what you do, though, is from what I understand, is that you pin things that you like, and you can kind of become the curator of your own private museum of self. And so I'm here groaning. This stings a little bit, okay. But what the author of the article, she referred to these different services as longing machines. I love that phrase. But we could actually turn that around a little bit and call them worship machines. Because so much of what we post on Facebook, what would you post on Instagram, or you pin on Pinterest, or whatever it is you do, reflects the very desires of your heart. I would be happier if I had this, or I'm happy if I can have the right, appropriate, list of my favorite bands, or I can self-edit any way I choose to have you think the best of me, and then I can be happy. So a really good way to see where you worship or what you worship is to think about what you want people to think of you or what makes you happy. Secondly, where do you spend your time, energy, money, or emotion? It used to be that people would say, show me your checkbook and I know exactly what's in your heart. Now it's show me your checkbook, show me your Pinterest account, show me everything else, and I know exactly the kinds of things you worship. What do you get emotional about? And even if you're a dude, you get emotional all the time. Like, don't kid me, bro. Like you yell at the TV, whether it's a football game or a political campaign ad, you're yelling. And that reflects what you worship. And God says all of those things can potentially become idols and become the wrong form of worship when you let those become the reigning and ruling influence in your whole life and in your heart. And so the problem that we often face then is that as Christians, we often replace the wrong things with a really good, shiny thing, and we forget that there's something that we missed along the way. Here's what I mean. Like when I was getting back in, like, really plugged into church again about 10 years ago, I would often hear people talk about like worship being like a really good experience, and they feel like they need that once a week. That way they can be energized for the work week that follows. Like they come in, they get refreshed on Sunday, that way they can come in then on the work week on Monday morning and feel like now I can really live for God, having been like refueled on Sunday morning. Okay, God's desire is to use His word, His worship, as oxygen, like it's the breath that we breathe. In Christianity and evangelical circles, we can often turn that into a vitamin that we pop once a week if we're lucky, and it makes us feel a little more energetic than we were before, and now we think we can get by. Okay, so if you are here and you have a really strong church background, the reason you often feel frustrated in your Christian experience, or the reason you often feel bored by most forms of Christianity, is because you're placing all of your hope and all of your energy into a once-a-week worship service or a once-a-day quiet time, and you're not really just experiencing the fullness of what God has in his worship experience. We'll touch on that later. So some of this really stings because it means that when we are looking at worship, we have to recognize that very often our hearts are completely inverted from what God originally had for us from the very beginning. And we see that all the time. We'll do John 4. We can go there. It's cool. John 4, turn with me real quick. We'll read a few verses. John 4, this is Jesus making a trip to Samaria. There he encounters a woman who comes out to a well in the middle of the day, braving the afternoon sun because the afternoon sun was preferable to the whispers of the other village women. And so Jesus asks the woman for a drink, and they exchange a few interesting words. And then he says this. He says, listen, this is verse 16, chapter 4. He says, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you are right in saying, I have no husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. The woman said to him, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. See, what's interesting here is the woman tries to change the subject. And I think what Jesus is thinking here is she's not changing the subject as far as she thinks. Like the reason she's hopping from bed to bed is because her heart is bent towards worship. It's just bent on worshiping the wrong thing. Her desire has now run amok so much that she can't tell the difference between the taste of fresh, true water and the sewer. And so Jesus' entire message to her is to reorient her and to reorient her heart away from all of the rough, bad stuff she's been through and to point her back towards the true worship that comes from worshiping God alone and a new form of worship that comes through the sacrifice of Jesus. So everybody worships something. It's just that Christian worship looks very different. Because Christian worship is the means by which we express and form our love for God and his kingdom. And that's the real difference. See, when we express and we form our love for God and his kingdom, suddenly we are drawn away from the prison of self, and we are drawn closer to what God actually has for each of us. See, each of our hearts is bent inexorably or just hell-bent, literally, towards self. Like we are selfish people. And everything in our world today tells us that we are worthy of adulation, congratulations, and forms of worship. Like some of you graduated very recently, and you sat through like a really long, maybe sunny ceremony where you had to endure a lot of speeches about how great like your life will become now. And some yahoo got up with a Dr. Seuss book, the places you will go, thinking they're the first person ever to do this, and they read you this long Dr. Seuss thing about how you, like in life you will succeed and things will be trouble along the way, but you will move mountains, and you've got the idea in your head that like you're now varsity, right? And the gospel says, listen, your heart is always going to be a factory for idols. Like even your desires and your dreams of success might be forms of self-worship. And here's the really sticky part. See, everybody worships something, but we also said in our definition that worship is not just the expression of our love, it's the formation of our love. Like we often forget that the way we worship can actually shape our character. Let's go back to Psalm 96, if I can find it again. Psalm 96, verse 4. David says this, "For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary." See, David instantly goes to this whole idea of there being other gods around, or at the very least, that Israel would often turn their attention away from God and look towards other nations or other deities or other gods that surrounded them or idols, looking for comfort, security, and protection. And what happened over and over again in Israel's past is that Israel never did well with blessing. And so every time Israel was blessed, she would screw up royally, and she would make a movement away from God in a way that actually shaped the nation in just fantastically negative ways. Jeremiah 2, it says, listen, God says through Jeremiah, you have gone after worthless things and you become worthless yourself. Like the more we pursue the wrong things, the more that we become an even wronger thing than ever before. It's subtle. It's very subtle. My nephew, for example, he likes to use his mom's or iPhone. And she downloaded like one of these apps that were like a storybook app where like it would read to you. And what we noticed like not too long ago is that he started using certain words wrong. And he kept using the word stalk. And we couldn't really figure it out. And then we realized it was a storybook app talking about storks, but the app came from England. And so like he developed an accent for a few words as a result. In fact, I actually heard a story recently. There was some lady who was not from England, but she faked a British accent while her child was growing up because she really, really wanted a kid that spoke with a British accent. That last one's weird. Here's my point. If even an accent can shape us, or even if just the environment we're in can shape the way we speak, how many other things around us can shape everything else about us? Like how much of our lives is accented by what we do and what we say? For instance, if I use my smartphone to engage with people and to communicate with people, that's probably a healthy thing. If I use my smartphone to screen my calls, or to dodge people's questions, or to give people orders, it's probably a less than healthy thing. But when I do that, even if I'm not expressly sinning, I am constantly just further bending my heart further towards myself and away from God and away from others. See, what we worship, or even the way we worship, shapes who we are. In other words, what we worship, we become. So many of us have sat through Christian experiences growing up where we are constantly just bombarded by these different messages of how we should appropriately worship God. And as I said before, when we turn that into the fuel or the vitamin that gets us by through the week, we are no longer worshiping Christ, but Christendom. In other words, we're more attached to the church and her practices than we are to the head of the church, which is Christ. And that wears us out, and it just draws us thin. Let's keep going. Psalm 96, this is verse 7. He says this, more commands. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. You know what ascribe means, right? It means to attribute or to say that God's great, like we're saying that God is glorious and strong. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the God in the splendor of holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. My third point is simply this. Worship is man's true purpose. Worship is the purpose for literally all that we do. How many of you grew up in a church background where you memorized or you recited the Westminster Catechism? Anyone? The Westminster Catechism, think of it like as a large Q&A book that talks about life and about how God fits into it. And the very first question you read is it asks this. It says, what is the chief end of man? In other words, what's man's ultimate purpose? And the answer they give is this. It's to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So even in this psalm, we see over and over again that we are to engage God through his glory. Like his glory is really what's God's really all about. The question then is this. If God is infinite and I'm not, how do I glorify someone who's infinite? In fact, think of it this way. How do we glorify God who's infinite when even our time is so finite and so constrained? The word glory in the Old Testament comes from a Hebrew word called that goes by kavod. Kavod, in its most literal definition, means weight or mass. So they're saying that God is massive, or like anyone who's still old enough to be from the 60s, you might have said something is really heavy. In other words, is God a significant part of your life? In other words, to glorify God means that you reveal how significant he is in literally every facet of your life. That's why over and over and over again, we see that God is ultimately, God's entire purpose for existence is to glorify himself. And that sounds really selfish if it weren't for the fact that he's God. If I'm on a life raft and I'm looking for the boat to come save me, I don't want a bunch of humble, weak, pansy sailors on the boat. I want a bunch of arrogant, proud, glorious, we're going to honk the horn and flash our lights. We want that kind of thing to happen. And so when God reveals his glory, it's not because he's selfish or arrogant. It's because he deserves the praise. And when he reveals that glory, he draws all men to himself. So over and over again in both the Old and New Testaments, we see that God is consistently all about God and not about me. Isaiah 49, he says that he created Israel for his glory. John chapter 7, everything Jesus does is to glorify the Father, to show the significance of what God has done. 1 Peter 4, talking about suffering. Even in suffering, God is glorified in that process. And of course, most famously, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31 says that whatever you eat or drink, do everything for the glory of God. In other words, everything you do in life is an act of worship. Everything. Here's the problem. There are 24 hours in a day. Most of us sleep. We work for about 8 hours, so there's 16 hours right there. There's like a 4 hours or so taking care of the kids and showering. We only have a certain number of hours left in our day to do anything, let alone find time to squeeze in reading the Bible or our quiet times or finding specific ways to have specific worship. How do we glorify God in all that we do? How do we drink our orange juice to the glory of God? How do we drive our car to the glory of God? See, the reason that we often get so strung out is that we think that when worship is just that 1 hour a week or that 1 hour of our devotion time, everything else just kind of becomes clutter and church becomes a hobby. It becomes that one thing you can fit in your schedule if there's nothing else going on. But if we do everything for the glory of God, if we just do everything in our lives for the glory of God, that means that we worship God not merely in the confines of a Sunday morning program, not merely in the confines of a community group, not merely in the confines of your devotion time, but everything that you do becomes an act of glorifying God. Everything you do reveals the significance of an almighty God. Look at Paul's life. His entire life was about glorifying God. Gets arrested, fine, I'll glorify God. I'll sing hymns. Your guys will get saved. That's just how it's going to work. Like they throw him out of the city, he comes right on back. Like everything he does is motivated by the glory of God. That's why he says that to live's Christ, to die is gain. Because nothing else matters other than the significance of a holy God. Let's finish our psalm. Psalm 96 again. This is verses 11 through 13. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes. For he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. That might make us a little bit nervous. What's happening here is that David is actually saying that listen, worship is no longer going to be confined, or was never meant to be confined, merely to God's people here in Israel. Like we see references here to the nations, to the world. He's saying that worship will literally break past our borders and expand into the entire world, to all people, that all will see God's glory and all will experience his judgment, whether they like it or not. So you glorify God by following him, or you glorify God by disobeying him, because even in judgment, God's significance is revealed. So whether you follow him or disobey him, you're always going to glorify God. And so what David is saying is that judgment is a major part of who God is, because righteousness is a major part of God's character. So if you're here this morning and you're still skeptical about the whole church thing, think of it this way. If you value justice, if you value wrongs being corrected, if you value the innocent being vindicated, if you value the guilty being punished, then you may not believe Christianity to be true, but you might want it to be true. Because Christianity is the only religion that says that all of those things will come to fruition and will come to pass through God's righteous vindication and judgment. At the same time, it might make you a little bit nervous, because most of us in here are not righteous on our own. I say most of us sarcastically. Like none of us in here are on our own even remotely close to being comparable to the incredible righteousness of God alone. None of us. And so David is saying that, listen, he will judge the world in righteousness. Like his righteous standard is the measuring stick by which our lives will one day be measured. In other words, we're expected to turn our hearts away from worshiping the wrong things and to turn our hearts to worshiping the right thing. There's just one problem. None of us can do that. Like the allure and the pull of the wrong thing is so strong, and our hearts have been so bent towards the wrong thing that on our own we really can't bend them back. We have tipped the scale so far towards self, we very often can't see anything else beyond it. We are locked in. And that's why the gospel is so significant. Because the gospel says that, yes, all of those things are true. In fact, if you're here this morning and you've been in church for a while, there's a really good chance that you're actually way worse than you think you are. Just saying. Because the reality is that we are so selfish that we often don't even see how selfish we are. In fact, sometimes we're so selfish that when we do the right thing, we're often doing it so others will not see the right thing, but they'll see us as the kind of guy who does the right thing. Like we don't really care about loving our neighbor. We want to be seen as the kind of guy who loves his neighbor. And that's selfish. That's a form of self-worship. And the more we do that, the more we express that love of self, the more we form that love of self, and the more that character becomes crystallized in each of us, so much so that we can't always break out of it. And that's why Jesus came to earth. He came because you and I can't break away from the worship of self to the worship of the true God. And so he came to live among us, to show what it looks like to glorify God in every facet of life, and to one day go to a cross that when he is lifted up, when he is exalted, when he is glorified, as John's gospel says, that when he is glorified in his death and his resurrection, all men are drawn to him. So Christian worship then looks very different from the Old Testament, because now Jesus has changed the actual form and the actual purpose behind what we actually do. Because before in the Old Testament, everything that worship was all about the word and the table. We had a whole sermon about this about a year ago, word and table. And what they would do in the Old Testament setting is that they would recite the covenant, the promise that God had made to them, and then they would actually observe that covenant by going to the table or the altar and making a sacrifice. I grew up in a church that actually had a large, wooden altar in the front. Maybe some of you guys did too, a very, sort of Baptist-y tradition of having a large symbolic piece of furniture. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it's symbolic. We don't have altars anymore, at least not in a literal sense. But we still worship God in word and table. It's just that the word has changed. Now we're no longer in the Old Testament covenants. The word is now the gospel. The word is the cross. The word is the resurrection. The word is new life in Jesus and the forgiveness of sins. And the table is remembering the once-for-all sacrifice, not through blood of bulls and goats, but through the one man who came to bleed and die for me. So we really don't have an altar at Tri-State, but we have our communion time, which we will in just a second. We have these 4 stations around the room, and wherever you pray, wherever you take those elements, that's your altar. There may not actually be a piece of furniture in front of you, but that's your altar, because it's there that you're remembering the gospel message. It's there that you're observing the once-for-all sacrifice made for you through Christ. And that's a really hard thing for some of us, because we don't always feel worthy of that. And often we come to church, we bow our heads, or even Saturday night beforehand, we have to get ourselves really psyched up about church and to really remember what it looks like to really be a good spiritual individual. And often that becomes a form of wearing a mask, which is itself another form of self-worship. No wonder we're exhausted. So the question comes down to this. If you're here this morning and you don't always feel that close to God, if you don't always feel as if you really have the spiritual pedigree of those who are before you, I get that. I talk to people periodically who say, listen, I've been a believer for all of 2 weeks, and I don't feel the same way that others do around me. And listen, that's okay. Because some things take time, and some things can't happen on a Sunday, but take a lifetime of Sundays and a lifetime of experiencing the presence of God. There was a man that Jesus talks about in one of his parables, a man who collected pearls. And one day he found a pearl that was worth just so much more than anything else that he'd ever seen. So he literally sold all that he had to go buy this pearl of great price. If we look at this man through worldly eyes, that we tend to see this as being a really foolish investment to sell all you have to further your collection. But Jesus says, listen, that's what the gospel is like. That everything else that we have pales in comparison to the new life that we get through the Spirit that testifies to the glory of Christ and the Father. So even if you're here this morning, you feel like you don't have a whole lot of faith, remember this. It's not the quantity of faith that you have, but the object of your faith that saves you. Like if you were to go out and be a betting man, and you had to go to a prize fight, is it better to bet a lot of money on the weak guy or bet a little bit of money on the strong guy? The answer is obvious, and even if we only have a little bit of faith, or we feel like we have very little faith in the God of the universe, it's the object, it's the strength of God and the purity of the gospel that allows us to enter his kingdom. See, when Jesus came to earth, he did so that through his life, through his sacrifice, he would draw all men to himself. And he leaves behind this meal that we're about to take to remind us of what that looked like and to remind us what it looks like to turn our worship away from self and back towards God. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the chance to gather together and examine more closely what worship is meant to be. Lord, I pray that as we take these elements of communion, that we remember what it was that you came to do, what you came to show us. Lord, we ask that your Spirit be present in this room, that those of us who maybe have spent far too long worshiping the wrong things would take the moments now to orient their hearts back towards the one true right thing, or the one true right person, the person who came to us even in our sin, who died for us even before we even heard his name, so that we could be found in your kingdom and we could be found in your presence and we could be made worthy not by the purity of our faith, but by the purity of your Son and his sacrifice. We ask that your presence be felt in this room this morning as we take these elements and we conclude our services this morning. In all things we ask in your Son's name and by your Spirit's power. Amen.